This is wrestling's greatest moments.
Hey now, wrestling fans. It's time for another episode of Wrestling's Greatest Moments. Ric Flair's legendary career began in 1972, but as we'll see, it was in 1974 that he began transforming into the world-class performer nicknamed the Nature Boy. Sit back as Wrestling's Greatest Moments looks at Ric Flair, the Mid-Atlantic years, from 1974 to 1976. Before we get started though, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single video. Training with Verne Gagne. Ric Flair had spent his early years in Verne Gagne's American Wrestling Association. Flair attended Gagne's training camp alongside future stars, including Ken Patera, the Iron Sheik, Jumping Jim Brunzell, and Greg Gagne. Flair began befriending veterans in the AWA and idolizing Dusty Rhodes so much that he wanted to work as Ricky Rhodes, according to the American Dream. Back when Rick first started and weighed about 300 pounds, he was driving down the road with me, driving my car as I gave him a ride to the next town. He looked over at me and said, "I want to ask you a question, a big favor of you. I got my wrestling name, and if it's okay with you, I want to be a cousin. I want to be a ramblin' Ricky Rhodes." I said to him, "No, make your own name. Be your own self. Make something of yourself in your own likeness of what you see, not ramblin' Ricky Rhodes." In 1974, Flair received an opportunity to work in Jim Crockett Promotions. The promotion changed management after the death of longtime promoter Jim Crockett Sr. Jim Crockett Jr. didn't want to run the promotion, but as fans know, ultimately did. How he went from wanting no part of it to taking control is explained in the book Sex, Lies, and Headlocks. Family matriarch. Elizabeth could see that Jimmy didn't want any part of it, so she handed the reins to her son-in-law, John Ringley, Francis's husband, who had been Big Jim's right-hand man. Unfortunately, he didn't last long in the job. When he was caught having an affair with a former Miss Tennessee, the family gathered and voted to kick him out. At 24, Jimmy was the only one in a position to take over. The promotion was already in the midst of a major transformation, not only establishing an identity as Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, the name longtime fans usually refer to it as, rather than Jim Crockett Promotions, but with new booker George Scott changing things from a tag team-oriented promotion to one that also focused on single stars. Scott brought in veteran wrestler Johnny Valentine, booking him as the territory's #1 villain. However, Scott was just getting started and wanted young talent, including rookie wrestler Ric Flair. As noted by historian and author Tim Hornbaker, Flair faced a big decision. His parents and Leslie's family all lived in the Twin Cities area. There was no guarantee of financial success in Charlotte, and if he did fail, he'd have to return home defeated. Finally, Flair agreed to go, and unsurprisingly, he had Verne Gagne's blessing. Gagne wanted him to gain more experience out on the circuit, and he expected him to rejoin the AWA after completing his tour. Traveling to other territories to gain experience was a given for any young wrestler. Wrestlers often worked in several territories before establishing themselves as anything more than enhancement talent. As we'll see, Ric Flair not only jumped into a top position early on, but he was so successful that Jim Crockett Promotions kept him around for years, with Flair only leaving once he became NWA World Champion and having to tour the world. Flair changed things up before he entered his new home, dyeing his hair blonde and dropping the K from his first name. Cosmetic changes, but ones that in hindsight began the process of him becoming a megastar. However, Flair's success was not guaranteed, and he took an enormous gamble. One that paid off, but one that saw many twists and turns where it appeared all was lost. Flair's fighting cousin. One of wrestling's long traditions is bringing new talent to a region and introducing them as a relative of established wrestlers. Whether it was kayfabe brothers like the Grahams, Eddie, Luke, Jerry, and later Billy, or here, cousins, wrestlers could get the rub by being paired with veteran stars. As we'll see, Flair was given quite the family tree, beginning with him entering the promotion as the cousin of veteran heel Rip Hawk. In his first memoir, To Be the Man, Slick Rick recalls what it was like working alongside Hawk. "George figured that Hawk could mold me as a wrestler, while I'd help him stay contemporary. I found him to be an intelligent guy who had a lot to offer someone with my relative inexperience." The pairing paid off quickly, with the two capturing the Mid-Atlantic Tag Team Championship from babyfaces Paul Jones and Bob Bruggers on July 4th, 1974. Hawk remembers working with Flair. He was greener than grass, He was a pretty good guy. He picked up pretty fast. We were together for about a year. The two held the title for over 5 months before losing the belts to Paul Jones and Tiger Conway Jr. While Flair adopted the style of an arrogant heel, his physical appearance was dramatically different than the Ric Flair best known today. Flair's friendship with real-life Olympic-level strongman Ken Patera saw him work his best to emulate Ken's incredible physique. According to Ken Patera, Ric Flair was passionate about everything he did, including training. There was no partying at the gym. Rick was all business. He couldn't lift what I could, but what he could do was help push me even harder. He would get excited at what I was doing, and I would have to work even harder. However, as Flair admits, things didn't quite turn out as planned. Before the Olympics, he was trying to become as big as possible. I began eating like him. We'd drink 2 gallons of milk and eat 2 dozen eggs, yolks and all, then go to Burger King for 5 Whoppers. He transformed everything into muscle. In my case, 40% of what I ate became fat. This was in 1972, and even by 1974, Flair didn't change his physical appearance, other than dyeing his hair. Instead, working a power-based offense. It was effective, and Flair may have felt that if it worked for his idol, Dusty Rhodes, it could work for him too. More cousins, more chaos. In early 1975, Mid-Atlantic fans discovered that Flair had more cousins in wrestling. Gene and Ole Anderson, aka the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, returned to the area. The Andersons were one of wrestling's toughest teams, and billing Flair as their cousin added even more legitimacy to Flair's reputation. Just how Rip Hawk fit into the family tree remains one of wrestling's biggest mysteries. The Andersons were kayfabe brothers, along with kayfabe brother Lars Anderson, and they welcomed Flair to the fold. Flair's relationship with the Andersons led to their teaming up, including a January 1975 6-man bout in which they defeated babyfaces Tiger Conway Jr., Swede Hansen, and Sandy Scott. The Andersons-Flair relationship would turn into one of wrestling's classic love-hate relationships, as Flair teamed with, but just as often fought against, his cousins. The Andersons-Flair relationship laid the groundwork for the legendary Four Horsemen faction, but that story remained a decade away. Things continued to go well for Flair as 1975 rolled around. Flair's ability to draw fans to shows was no fluke. In February, Flair defeated popular star Paul Jones for the NWA Mid-Atlantic Television Championship, Flair's first singles title. The 6-month title reign showed how much confidence Jim Crockett Promotions had in Flair. That was just one aspect, as Booker George Scott saw a way for Flair to take things to the next level. As noted in Tim Hornbaker's book, The Last Real World Champion, The Legacy of Nature Boy Ric Flair, Scott was familiar with the work of Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, who had transformed the world of professional wrestling with his combination of athleticism, charisma, and an arrogant personality. Rogers wasn't the first person cast in this mold, but he took things further, and now Scott hoped Flair could as well by adopting a Nature Boy gimmick. The Nature Boy gimmick only added a new dimension to Flair's overall wrestling persona, which was electrifying for the young performer. He talked about his impressive income and wardrobe, all in his conceited style, and his snobbish attitude disgusted the casual fan. Wrestling fans have seen other wrestlers adopt popular wrestler moves and personas to establish themselves, but Flair was no carbon copy. According to Rick, I knew that Rogers used to strut into the ring, so I started doing the same thing. That doesn't mean that I did the same strut. No one could strut like Buddy Rogers, just like no one can swagger to the ring like Vince McMahon. I just developed a Ric Flair strut, sometimes breaking into it in the middle of the action. Like Rogers, I used the figure 4 leg lock as my signature move. However, Flair soon found one aspect of Rogers' persona that was better left to the original Nature Boy. When people told me that he used to smoke cigars, I went through my own cigar smoking phase and burned holes in all my clothes. As Tim Hornbaker notes, Flair's approach worked well for him. Flair may have been using the gimmick created by Buddy Rogers, but he was introducing his own take on the Nature Boy character. It was a stark contrast to many of his contemporaries, and his flashiness and perceived unpredictability were magnetic. Although TV footage from this era is rare, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling historians David Chappell and Dick Bourne discovered Ric Flair using the Nature Boy nickname in early 1975, with Flair even using his now trademark "Woo!" As Bourne wrote back in 2019, David Chappell came across an audio recording of a local promo Rick did for a May 1975 match in Richmond, Virginia. Ric actually did the promo in late April for a match to take place on May 2nd. He was defending his Mid-Atlantic TV title in the Richmond Arena against the man he beat for that belt, number 1 Paul Jones. As for the promo, here's Flair showing how he had quickly become a verbal virtuoso. "Jones, I'm gonna take you like any wild animal would. I'm gonna break one of your arms, and then maybe you'll be walking around the drugstore looking for someone else to beat up on, because it won't be the Nature Boy. Woo!" Apologies to Ric Flair. No one can woo like you. Flairs War with Wahoo. Flair began working at the top of the card as he defended the NWA television title. The Nature Boy began headlining shows in smaller markets until he headlined shows in larger markets. Now, promoter George Scott was ready to move Flair into an even more prominent role. Scott brought Wahoo McDaniel into the area, well aware of McDaniel's well-deserved reputation as a top babyface draw. The Mid-Atlantic area had no shortage of opponents for McDaniel, including his longtime rival Johnny Valentine, who he'd battled with for months over the Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight Championship before finally winning it in June 1975. Now, Scott wanted to see how Flair would do against McDaniel. Once again, it was a sign of Scott's faith in Flair, and once again, Flair would exceed expectations. Behind the scenes, Flair and McDaniel had become fast friends, but on camera, they were bitter enemies. It was obvious to fans that both men despised each other and weren't happy beating each other in the ring. Flair usually battled Wahoo in tag team battles, teaming with Flair's mentor, Johnny Valentine. Eventually, the battles turned into singles contests as Flair hunted Wahoo for McDaniel's Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight Championship, a key title in the territory. Mid-Atlantic had recently introduced its version of the United States Heavyweight Championship, but the Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight title was no mid-card belt. While the U.S. title was often viewed as granting the wearer number 1 contender status for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship, the Mid-Atlantic Championship was highly respected and often used to main event wrestling cards. The Nature Boy's quest for more gold was not easy. McDaniel repeatedly thwarted Flair's bid for the belt until he put his hair on the line against the title. Fans were eager to see Flair lose his blonde locks and eat some humble pie. Unfortunately, they were disappointed as Flair used brass knuckles to send Wahoo into dreamland. Flair was now Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight Champion, his second singles title in the promotion. 1975, the year that changed everything. Wahoo McDaniel was eager to get his title back, but first, Flair had to deal with the biggest challenge of his life, a devastating airplane accident that nearly ended his career. While the airplane crash has been covered in our video, the deadly plane crash that nearly ended wrestling, let's briefly review what happened. On October 4th, 1975, a yellow and white Cessna 310 left Charlotte carrying 5 passengers headed for a Jim Crockett Promotions show at Wilmington's Legion Stadium. Aboard the flight were wrestlers Ric Flair, Tim Mr. Wrestling Woods, Johnny Valentine, and Bob Bruggers, along with David Crockett, the brother to promoter Jim Crockett Jr. As detailed by John Molinaro in the 2000 article, The Plane Crash That Changed Wrestling. As they approached the Wilmington Airport runway, the plane ran out of gas, cutting across several treetops and a utility pole before crashing to the ground. Why did the plane run out of gas? Molinaro notes, their crash came about as a result of human error. The pilot, Vietnam veteran Joseph Michael Farkas, had trouble getting the plane off the ground in Charlotte because of the bulk of the wrestlers. He did not distribute the weight of the passengers in the plane properly and decided to dump fuel from the gas tank to lighten the load. Tim Hornbaker writes about the accident at length in his biography of Flair. One of the Cessna's 2 engines failed near Lumberton. Instead of landing there to inspect the malfunction, Farkas kept going, apparently confident he could make it to their destination safely. A mile from the Wilmington Airport, the fuel gauge dropped to 0 and cockpit alarms sounded. Farkas lost both engines, and it became clear that they were going to crash. The plane crashed, resulting in serious injuries to everyone on board. Johnny Valentine was partially paralyzed, forcing him out of wrestling. Bob Bruggers was injured, and while he could have continued wrestling, he chose to retire. Babyface wrestler Mr. Wrestling was injured, but forced himself to work to dispel rumors that he'd been aboard the plane with heels, a breach of kayfabe that could have seriously hurt Jim Crockett Promotions. Announcer David Crockett was hurt but recovered. Pilot Mike Farkas was seriously injured, and for decades, it's been reported that he died 1 or 2 years after the crash. However, author Tim Hornbaker's research uncovered that Farkas lived until 1988. As for the official cause of the accident, after an inquiry, The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the pilot in command, Farkas, was responsible for the mismanagement of fuel and a failure to follow approved procedures. Ric Flair's prognosis was initially bad. Flair had suffered compressed fractures in his back, with doctors telling him that his career was over. Undaunted, Flair took his time recovering, and eventually, he was told a return to the ring would be possible. However, it would be a daunting journey that transformed Flair physically and completed his metamorphosis into the Nature Boy character that many fans consider the greatest of all time. Flair spent the remainder of 1975 recovering and rebuilding himself, a difficult but ultimately fulfilling mission. What do you think of Ric Flair's early years in Jim Crockett Promotions? Did you get to see any of Flair's career from this era? Share your thoughts in the comments section, and let us know if there are any videos you'd like wrestling's greatest moments to cover. In the meantime, subscribe to our channel, follow us on X and Instagram, and spread the good news about wrestling's greatest moments, the channel that celebrates the squared circle.